Namaskar. I'm Dr. Nalini Avinash Wagmare, working as an associate professor at Tilak Maharashtra Vidyapeeth, Pune. Today's our topic is scope of history. History writing is very old art, and in the past only few took to it. That is one reason as to why the ancient world could produce only few good historians. They confined their writings to royal courts, military achievements, war methods, nature worship, religion, etc. Because of love of nationalism, their area of work was very limited, but nowadays widening scope of history is started. With the passage of time, the scope of history has been widened and the new areas included in it. History is gradually assuming all the three dimensions, as its main job is to narrate what happened, to discuss how it happened, and to analyze why it happened. The historians have developed humanistic and critical outlook. They now discuss multifarious activities of common men, including their social activities and social customs and conventions. History is no longer a branch of literature or politics or philosophy or any other discipline. It has an independent status of its own, whose main function is now to study society in its aspect of promoting a culture which constitutes knowledge, faith, belief, art, morals, customs, and any other capabilities or habit acquired by man as a member of society. The scope of history includes all activities of man. The historian must look beyond government to people, beyond laws to legends, beyond religion to folklore and the arts, and he must study every phenomenon, whether intellectual, political, social, philosophical, material, moral, or emotional, relating to man in society. History has to consider primarily the social life of man, his political achievements, his cultural attainments, his constitutional management, and his economic endeavor from the main scope of history. As it is through the medium of state and society that man finds his identity. Nevertheless, the history of ideas, the history of science, and the history of art are all quite relevant to us. Then even the common man and his life is now attracting the attention of the historian, who had so long neglected study of these essential elements. So now the all man's every activities of man included in history. It was only the great man who had become the center of attraction. According to Chinese proverb, the great man is a public message. It is common man who has played vital role in assisting the great man to achieve fame. The Ranke, Napoleon Legion shed their blood, but the fame went to their master. From the pyramids of Egypt to the skyscrapers of America, the common man has given his sweat and blood to make nation great. It was only the mass movement that helped the Indian independent fighter achieve their goal. Then other also mentioned that the scope of history, the study of economic and social change. In the past, no attempt was made by historians in this direction. The reason is quite obvious. The means of communication being very slow, it was difficult to collect materials and data on world events. Another reason, narrow national outlook of the nations. But now there was also international body where nations could meet to discuss world issues. But writing world history has become easy because means of transportations have become very easy and rapid, and also world bodies like League of Nations, even UNO, have emerged on world scene. First such attempt was made by H.G. Wells, who wrote Outlines of World History. Then the philosophy of history has made the subject of history very profound, even since the time of Voltaire, who coined the phrase. Great thinkers like Hegel, Marx, Comte, Spengler, Proust, Dostoevsky have contributed much to the philosophy of history. The kind of history does not treat isolated events or the role of individuals, but takes into account the progress and decline of societies with reference to all aspects of human culture. To a social scientist, all history is social history, though other historians may classify it as social history, political history, economic, religion, or history of some other kind. So, scope of history is ever expanding. Thus, the scope of history ever expanding. Herodotus, the father of history, was merely an excellent storyteller. But only 13 years later, his successor is a scientific historian. 19th century historians dealt largely with the governments and great men, with the development of national consciousness and the growth of political liberalism. The 20th century witnessed a change in emphasis towards economic and social history, towards people and away from individuals. The shape and content of history has also undergone a change depending upon the material. Anthropology has also excited in the interest of the aborigines. Social transformation of small communities who are a little pusher up than the aborigines has been greatly facilitated by the availability of modern sophisticated techniques. From the objective imperialism to historicism started. So stress is now on historicism, which means tracing the growth and development of an event from its early stages. On the other hand, objective empiricism means establishing facts as this way. So, a new concept of historical relativism has also emerged, which has further widened the scope of history. This concept was the byproduct of the closer study of French and Einstein, whose principles were applied to historical growth and development. Then the 19th century, which is called the century of history, has humanized history and made it a center of reality and of thought. Change in the scope of the study of history was also affected with the development of historiography. Till 19th century, history was confined to the study of the political events and institutions. But at present, even the social, economic, moral, literary life of the peoples also included in the scope of history. With a view to make history more interesting to the readers, greater attention is also paid to literary excellence. The other features of present history or study of history are emphasis on greater attention on systematic and exhaustive collection of source materials and adaptation of a critical attitude in making their assessment. From local to a regional history writing, they are getting attracted towards writing world history. From urban areas, they are moving to rural areas, and from elite to the common man. Thus, whole outlook and approach of historians has altogether changed. Scope of history was widened to include religion, philosophy, poetry, art, law, morality, science, and culture, and less important was attached to war, political kings, and courts. A union of philosophy took place with philosophy, and history became the teacher of virtue. Then the scope of subject history. History means the accounts of the past human civilization. The scope of history means the breadth, comprehensiveness, variety, and extent of learning experience provided by the study of this subject. An account of history was once limited to a local history, but in course of centuries, it changed into universal story. But in course of centuries, it changed into universal history of human mind, mankind, in which man's achievement in every field of life, may be political, social, economic, cultural, scientific, technological, religious, and artistic, were depicted. Then local to global history. The subject history was once limited to local area, and after centuries it became the universal depicted man's achievements in local, regional, national, international level. In ancient times, history included all activities, achievements such as science, technologies, discoveries, invention, and adventures. The social life of man, political achievement, cultural achievements, constitutional rule and economic activities from the subject matter of the historian. A nation became great for the great sacrifice of the common man. Due to mass movement, the Indian freedom fighters were able to achieve their goal. But earlier they suffered much due to tyrannical rule of the kings, courts, and central government. The historian also neglected the life of ordinary men, women, and children. But now the minute in examination of every element in society is called microhistory, and it is becoming very popular now. History includes man's behavior and economic activities. It includes social, law, culture, food, dress, ornaments, rituals, rites, and religious festivals. Moreover, it discussed the various political institutions, languages, songs, dances, arts, crafts, etc. As a result, history divides into different parts like economic history, social history, political history, literary history, intellectual history, diplomatic history, universal history, and legal history. The economic and social changes gain greater prominence in history. As a result of social changes, caste and classification discussions, family life, position of women, customs, manners, and way of life attracted the attention of the historians. Then the discovery of ancient coins and inscription widened again the scope of history. In the 19th century, geology and archaeology further widened the knowledge of ancient history. Coins and inscription, geology, life art, architecture, sculpture, culture, trade, commerce, foreign relations of ancient civilizations. The archaeologists opened new ground for historians, though their discoveries are responsible for uh, pushing back the history by millions of years. Then collect data of events. The scope of history is ever expanding and history is assuming a universal character. In the 19th century, historians discuss about government, the great men, development of national consciousness, and the growth of political liberalism. The history of America, Africa, China, Latin America, India evolved as much interest in Europe. Due to available data, material, the shape and content is changed now. Anthropology, archaeology, historical relativism are now the part of modern history. With the passage of time, new things will be added in history. That is the reason the scope of history is uh, increasing or widening one. Then features of the scope. In order to facilitate understanding the scope of history, following features would be helpful. The scope of historical study depends upon the subject of inquiry of the past events. The scope of history is determined by the activities, experiences, and thoughts of men at different times in the past. The scope depends on the nature of inquiry of the past, such as political, social, economic, or other kind of inquiry. Thus, if you want to know a single aspect of Quit India movement of 1942, say economic aspect, its scope is narrow. Then a assessment of the movement from different angles. If we intend to study universal history of the progress of mankind, it is greater in extent than a local or a national history is necessary. Similarly, when we think about world history, the time factor makes it necessary to define what exactly we want to study. If we simply say human activities, it would mean a never-ending search as human activities from the beginning to our days implies scope beyond our human capacities. Just as the present has innumerable matters for consideration, the past, which for some generation in the past was a living present, and as such they deal with many known and unknown matters. The scope of our studies in general matters would be both impossible and may end in a cloud. We have therefore to fix our attention on some experts. Then what were the limitations of the scope of history? A subject matter of history, widening scope of history. So some limitations is also there. When we say history is a study of man's activities in the time, the scope of our inquiry is limited by the time factor. If we do not fix the time of what happened in the past, it would be fantasy. The scope of history is limited by our knowledge of chronological details. Man appeared on this planet several million years ago, but the recorded history of his activities cannot be pushed back beyond 5,000 years. Those records do not give us a clear idea of his activities in civilized societies. History in real sense of the term began when the Greek statesman warrior Herodotus wrote notes in sources in historical research 16 about Greco-Persian War in 5th century BC. This was the first history of its kind in the world, and the beginning of history is thus reckoned from that time. The scope of history of the world is thus limited to the history of man's social activities to a few thousand years. The activities of men before the historical period, that is 5th century BC, is involved in the means ignored. The second factor that limits the scope of history is the geographical factor. When we talk about world history, we actually refer to few places on the earth. As everybody knows, more than half the surface of the earth is covered by water. Out of the remaining part of sizable surface is occupied by hills, mountains, deserts and rivers, ice, etc. Thus, the habitable portion of the earth is limited. Further, man grew civilization in a few favorable lands. The scope of history is thus limited. Then thirdly, scope of history cannot be rigidly fixed at any time. Suppose today we say history covers life of man and his activities in civilized society. A few years or centuries after some time, historians would say history is concerned with the activities and experience of men and women only in highly developed societies. Or they may say it is confined only to the society which are now developing. So fourthly, just as scope of history is limited by time, it is limited by prevailing conception of history at a given time. In communist countries, the conception of history is different from those of democratic countries or countries under despotic rule. Thus, the scope of historical inquiry responds to the necessity of knowing the truth about certain people at certain time. Then what were the functions of history? History has mainly two functions to perform. One is to collection of data and the other one is the interpretation data to explain the fundamental process of history. The first part has to be objective and therefore scientific. And the second part first has to be objective and therefore scientific. Trivially, there are three distinct functions which a historian has to be performed. There are scientific, imaginative, and literary. Nature also comes within the scope of history. If it has anything to do with man, the rivers, hills, lakes, mountains, seas figure greatly in history in the context of their shaping man's destiny. But today, in the scope of history, are covered both man and nature and a historian. While writing history, cannot ignore either of these. The Indus, the Ganges, the Himalayas have played a significant part in Indian history. Plassey and Panipat would not have been heard of but for Napoleon, Clive, and Babur respectively. The Kaveri gained importance in Karnataka history because a great son of India built a dam across this river. Therefore, the scope of history includes both man and nature, so far as these two play a significant part in the life of mankind. It is the story of the development of human society, its arts and letters, philosophy and religion, adventure and administration, culture and way of life, and all other aspects related to man's significant activities. The study of history is no waste of time or luxury, but a pressing need. Nations that forget history will have no future. History has two main functions to perform. One is to offer broad principle and generalization of historical truth. The other is to combine the merits of drama and epic poetry with the merit of truth. So, history attempts to give us the meaning of life. While the functioning of history, it helps in solving present-day problems. A knowledge of past has to be man suffered because of his mistake may help humanity to correct itself, and thus history may meet the demands of pressing social needs. It excites interest since the history touches almost every important area of human activity, as like activities like wars, conquest, adventures, personalities, revolutions, religion, philosophy, etc. Therefore, it excites interest. It provides intellectual satisfaction. Every intellectual, when he studies past history, feels absolutely satisfied. He gets good food for thought, something to ponder over, and is compelled to think how civilization has progressed from past to present. So the history is another function. It has ability to improve understanding. No issue can be properly understood without its historical background. History not only tells about the right principle of life, but also warns us through concrete examples about inevitable destruction of society if this principle were to be neglected. It enlarges area of human experience. It is history which tells us about the interaction of circumstances on individuals and their constituents. Not only this, but it provides useful guiding lines for future. It tells us way to prosperity. It is from what we learn that skill, belief, and organization collectively have been responsible for human progress. And by properly doing our job by having the right ideas even today, we can make rapid progress and have peace and prosperity. It illustrates general laws governing society. It indicates what type of mistake man has made in the past. Now he avoid this in future. How he can preserve our four freedoms, namely the freedom from want, from expression, oppression, and freedom of religion. The moralities require that man should put his concerns in harmony with the true historical development. A society without history would be like a man without memory. Thinkers have gone to extent saying that all our hopes of the future depend on sound knowledge of the past. An objective study of history would save humanity from bigotry, bias, and oppressions. Fostering a feeling of nationalism is foster patriotism in our youth and inculcates in young minds moral laws of right and wrong. It instills in them sense of love and for motherland. Further, history has commonly understood not only gives us information but also sharpens our intellect to interpret the past. It gives us limitless pleasure by making us known the richness and variety of life. This richness and variety forms the subject matter of history. Surely we may agree with Lord Acton that if the past has been an obstacle and a burden, knowledge of past is the surest and safest emancipation. Then coins, stamps, movements, newspapers, films, and television often employ historical themes and motifs. In many instances, the events are distorted or oversimplified. Sometimes they are turned on to the service of propaganda. But such uses only serve to illustrate the need for good historical writing. Many millions have found historical literature a pleasure to read. It provides something akin to the movement and variety of travel. It gives a sense of participation in the affairs of race. It is history which helps the society to know itself in relation to the past and with other societies and cultures. Subject matter of history, man and his activities. The necessity for history arises because of two functions. One is functional and another. So the because of functions, various activities, various topic, uh, each and every point involving in history. So widening scope of history we find, but some limitations also find, and some functions of the history is also studies in this lecture. For more detail, you can refer these books. And these two paper also I refer for my lecture. So I have mentioned you can also refer for detailed studies.